Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when sin was organized, taxed, and politely tolerated, as long as it stayed in its proper district. The Middle Ages are often remembered for piety, knights, and the smell of damp stone. But beneath the hymns and the heraldry, there was an entire shadow economy built around desire. And here's the strange part: it wasn't illegal. In most medieval cities, brothels weren't just tolerated, they were municipal institutions. They had licenses, curfews, and, occasionally, official uniforms. Think of them less as dens of vice and more like mildly embarrassing civic utilities. The Church condemned fornication, of course, but it also understood human nature. As one theologian helpfully put it, better to have a few harlots than many honest women defiled. So, yes, brothels were allowed, encouraged even, but as with all things medieval, there was a catch, or rather, several. Let's start in Paris, around the year 1250. The city was growing fast crowded, noisy, full of merchants and monks, students and thieves. At night, the streets turned into a maze of candlelight and whispers. And somewhere near the river banks, under flickering torches, you'd find the Rue du Bordel. That word bordel eventually gave us brothel. These establishments weren't hidden. They operated openly, under the watchful eye of city officials. Their madams paid taxes, their workers were registered, and their clientele included everyone from bakers' apprentices to bishops in disguise. It was, in its own way, a public service, a kind of medieval pressure valve. Better, the city reasoned, to keep lust contained within walls than let it wander into respectable homes. But here's the catch. Women who worked there had no rights. They were both protected and imprisoned by law. They couldn't wear jewelry. They couldn't live outside the red light district, and they had to mark themselves with specific clothing, usually a striped hood or yellow scarf, so everyone would know exactly who they were. A strange sort of freedom that came with a uniform of shame. Over in London, things weren't much different. The city's famous stews, a charming term derived from bathhouses, lined the south bank of the Thames in the district of Southwark. They were technically under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, which meant the church itself licensed and profited from prostitution. Naturally, these bathhouses were supposed to offer relaxation, a soak, a massage, perhaps a discreet conversation. In practice, they were brothels with better plumbing. The women who worked there were known as Winchester geese. It sounds almost quaint, until you remember that geese were also plucked. The nickname wasn't an accident. They were forbidden from marrying, owning property, or being buried in consecrated ground. When they died, and many did young, their bodies were tossed into unconsecrated pits along the river bank, known grimly as the Crossbones Graveyard. So, yes, brothels were legal. But for the women inside them, legality didn't mean dignity. Still, these districts thrived. Kings winked at them. Priests pretended not to see. And ordinary men, soldiers, sailors, apprentices considered them part of city life. Medieval authorities even issued detailed rules for proper conduct. In some cities, customers were required to remove their daggers before entering, a reasonable safety precaution. In others, visiting hours were restricted to certain days to ensure that no one skipped Sunday Mass for a more horizontal form of worship. And in some places, there were official inspection days when health officers, usually older women, checked that workers were free from disease. a medieval version of public health policy carried out with candles, vinegar, and astonishing awkwardness. Of course, morality is a slippery thing. The same city that taxed its brothels would publicly shame their residents. Preachers thundered against women of sin on Sunday, only to visit them quietly on Wednesday. It was, as ever, an age of contradiction, and at the center of it all were the women themselves, often poor, widowed, or simply out of options. Work in a brothel could mean survival. It could also mean ruin. Many came from rural villages, drawn by the lure of city life. Some were former servants dismissed for being too familiar with their masters. Others were sold by families in debt because poverty, in the Middle Ages, didn't leave much room for sentimentality. They lived communally, slept in cramped dormitories, and paid rent to their madam. Some managed to save money and buy their freedom. Most didn't, and if they tried to leave, they often found the outside world far less forgiving than the brothel walls. Not all brothels were equal, of course. In big cities like Venice, there were clear social hierarchies, from the luxurious cortesiane oneste, the honest courtesans, who entertained noblemen and scholars, to the meretrici di canale, the canal girls who worked in small boats along the waterways. The courtesans were educated. They read poetry, played music, and wrote letters in elegant Latin. They were part seductress, part intellectual, part survivalist. Men bragged about their company in the same way they bragged about owning fine art. But the canal girls, those were another matter. They were cheap, desperate, and visible. Venice passed laws to keep them out of sight, shunting them to specific bridges and alleys where tourists wouldn't complain. The irony, of course, is that those same tourists went looking for them anyway. In Avignon, where the papacy relocated during the 14th century, the brothels didn't close, they multiplied. Because where there are clergy, there is demand. The city became infamous for its houses of women, discreetly run but conveniently close to the papal palace. When the Black Death hit in the 1340s, the church briefly tried to shut them down, divine punishment and all that, but within a few years, the houses reopened. Apparently, humanity's appetite for comfort survived the plague just fine. So how did the church justify it all? The official stance was moral containment. If prostitution existed, it was better to regulate it than pretend it didn't. St. Augustine himself had once argued that society without sex workers would overflow with lust. A rather vivid image. So, in a way, these women were performing a kind of service, absorbing sin so others could remain pure. A strange, backhanded sainthood. But the rhetoric didn't match the reality. They were excluded, ridiculed, and disposable. And when morality shifted, the same people who had profited from them turned on them with righteous fury. By the late 15th century, attitudes began to harden. Reformers like Savonarola thundered from pulpits about the filth of Florence. Cities began closing their official brothels. What had once been tolerated became shameful. But closing the doors didn't make the trade vanish, it just pushed it underground. Private houses replaced public ones. Secret courtyards replaced tax ledgers. Human desire, as always, simply changed addresses. Let's drift for a moment through one of those dim medieval streets. The air smells of wood smoke and wine. A church bell tolls somewhere distant. You can almost hear the soft laughter behind shuttered windows and the faint splash of water from a bathhouse down the lane. Outside, a patrol of guards walks past, pretending not to notice. Inside, A woman ties a yellow scarf around her hair, the mark she's required to wear, and waits for another knock at the door. That knock might bring her food money, it might bring trouble, it might bring a priest who will beg forgiveness tomorrow morning. That was the rhythm of life in medieval brothels, legal but never clean. And yet, amid all this hypocrisy, something human persisted. Some women found friendship, safety, even a kind of power within those walls. A few became madams themselves, running houses, negotiating contracts, and managing money better than most men were allowed to. Others became mistresses to nobles, rising if only temporarily from poverty to silk sheets and candlelight. History remembers them poorly, but they existed, navigating a world that offered them no other map. Centuries later, the official records remain tax rolls, court cases, moral decrees, all describing the business of sin in bureaucratic Latin. And if you read between the lines, you can almost sense the absurd normality of it all. The medieval world wasn't as prudish as we imagine. It was just very practical. Sin, when properly managed, was profitable. And perhaps that's the real lesson of medieval brothels. They were less about lust and more about order, the strange, moral math of an age that tried to balance God with gold. Let's drift now, away from the flickering lamplight of the red light districts and into the quieter chambers of those who made the rules. Because for every woman forced to wear a yellow scarf, there was a man in velvet robes writing sermons about purity between visits to confession. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, let's drift a little further along the Thames, where the air smells faintly of river mud, roasting fish, and wet wool. It's London, around the year 1350, a city where the churches toll constantly, and the water, somehow, is always cold. On the south bank of the river lies Southwark, a lively patch of ground technically outside the city walls. That small detail matters, because what happened outside the walls didn't count quite the same way. Inside the walls, morality, guilds, taxes, law. Outside the walls, theatres, taverns, and brothels. And who controlled those brothels? Not a gang, not the crown, but the church itself specifically, the Bishop of Winchester. It's one of those charming little facts history likes to hide between the lines. The same bishop who preached against sin on Sunday also collected rent from prostitutes on Monday. The Bishop of Winchester was no minor cleric. His diocese stretched across southern England, rich in farmland, salt, and trade. And yet he also owned a very profitable piece of London, a string of bathhouses turned brothels known as the Stews of Southwark. Stew comes from the old French estuve, meaning a heated bath. Originally, these were public bathhouses where one could relax, get clean, and occasionally leave slightly dirtier than before. By the 14th century, everyone knew what went on there. The stews were brothels in all but name warm rooms, scented water, and the promise of forgetfulness. The bishop didn't operate them directly, of course. That would have been unseemly. Instead, he leased the buildings to madams, who in turn paid him rent and taxes. It was a tidy system, sin, but with receipts. There were even official regulations, the rules of the stew holders, a kind of medieval handbook for managing immorality. They were surprisingly detailed. No married women could work there, no nun could be employed, which you'd hope was obvious. No man could be kept by a prostitute, as that might lead to emotional complications. And absolutely no one could stay open during Lent. Because priorities. The bishop's clerks collected rent quarterly, and every year the church's accountants dutifully recorded the proceeds, One 14th-century ledger from Winchester's estates lists the income from the women's houses across the Thames. No shame, just neat handwriting. For centuries, this system ran smoothly. London's moralists tutted, but no one actually wanted the stews gone. They provided order, predictability, and a convenient outlet for what polite society didn't want to acknowledge. As one city magistrate put it, in an unguarded moment of honesty, it is better they dwell there than wander through the town. The women who worked there, the Winchester geese, were bound by law to their district. They couldn't live elsewhere. They wore identifying scarves or hoods, so no one mistook them for respectable citizens, and they were inspected regularly by midwives to check for disease. The rules were meant to protect customers, not the workers. If a woman fell ill, she was often expelled, her possessions confiscated by the madame or the church's bailiff. When she died, and many did, she wasn't buried in holy ground. Instead, her body went to the Cross Bones graveyard, a patch of unconsecrated soil just south of the river. A place for the unwanted dead prostitutes, paupers, and criminals all resting together under layers of forgotten earth. If you walk near Borough High Street today, you can still find the iron gates of Cross Bones. People leave flowers and ribbons there, a quiet apology centuries too late. Back in the 14th century, though, the bishop's system was considered almost enlightened. After all, the church reasoned, these women provided a necessary service to protect the virtue of others. St. Thomas Aquinas himself had written something to that effect. Remove prostitutes from human affairs, and you will unsettle everything with lust. A strange defense, but a very medieval one. The logic went like this. Lust is inevitable. Sin is inevitable, so it's best to contain it. Better to have a controlled fire than a wild one. And so, the bishop became reluctantly, officially, the landlord of London's lust. Naturally, this arrangement caused the occasional scandal. Every few decades, some particularly pious monarch or priest would remember that prostitution was technically a mortal sin, and try to shut the stews down. It never lasted long. Edward III tried once. So did Henry V. But each time, the city pushed back. Merchants complained about losing commerce. Sailors grumbled. Even the clergy, it seemed, weren't too enthusiastic about losing their favorite bathhouses. The stews always reopened, because, as it turned out, holiness was less profitable. Still, the Bishop of Winchester maintained an interesting double life. Publicly, he denounced sin. Privately, his accountants made sure every brothel paid on time. There's a certain poetry to that. The man responsible for saving souls also managed one of England's most successful red light districts. We don't know exactly what the bishops themselves thought about it. There are no confessional diaries saying, "Feeling conflicted about the brothel income today," but we do have sermons from nearby priests complaining that they were losing parishioners not to heresy, but to pleasure. One London friar lamented that men would rather bathe their flesh than cleanse their souls. A fair point, though one suspects he might have been slightly envious. By the 15th century, Southwark's stews had become so notorious that their names entered popular slang. To take a goose flight meant to visit the district. A stew-bred lad was a troublemaker, and Winchester goose became a grim euphemism for venereal disease. The irony. The disease that spread from those houses eventually became one of the arguments for shutting them down, the same disease that had funded church repairs for a century. Sin giveth, sin taketh away. But perhaps the strangest part of the story is how normal it all seemed. To the people of medieval London, this wasn't hypocrisy, it was administration. The church wasn't condoning lust, it was managing it, and management, after all, was holy work. It's easy to imagine the bishop sitting at his desk, quill in hand, signing off on some dull financial document labeled Preventus Destuis Income from the Stews, then rising to deliver a sermon about chastity. A man must multitask. If you listen carefully to the logic of that world, it starts to sound almost serene in its contradictions. They truly believed that by organizing sin, they were protecting virtue. By taxing lust, they were purifying the city. And by controlling women's bodies, they were saving men's souls. A comforting illusion at least for those not doing the work. Over time, though, even the church's patience began to fray. The Reformation loomed on the horizon, bringing sharper lines between purity and corruption. Soon, bishops would no longer be able to lease property for stews without public outrage. But for now, the Bishop of Winchester's district remained the safest and most profitable patch of sin in England. A place where sermons echoed across the river, but no one listened too closely. So, as London's bells toll midnight, let's leave the bishop to his ledgers and drift a little southward, across the Alps, to a place where pleasure was not just tolerated, but celebrated, where women of the night became queens of wit, and desire was dressed in silk and poetry. Hey everyone, if your eyes are still open, let's drift east away from London's muddy banks and up the Adriatic coast, where the air tastes faintly of salt and candle smoke. It's the 15th century, and we've arrived in Venice, the floating republic of masks, merchants, and moral flexibility. Venice has always been a city that pretended to be holy while winking at the camera. It had churches on every corner and confessionals in every parish, but it also had an economy that ran on luxury, silk, and a little sin. And no one mastered that balance better than the Venetian courtesans. The city even called them, somewhat poetically, les honestes courtisanes, the honest courtesans. Honest not because they were virtuous, but because they didn't lie about what they sold. To understand Venice, you have to picture it as it was. A place where gold glimmered under every archway, and gossip floated faster than the tides. Narrow bridges, secret doors, and masked faces, perfect for romance, intrigue, and denial. The brothels here weren't tucked away in alleys. They were part of the city's rhythm. Sailors arrived. Merchants lingered, nobles passed through in their gondolas pretending to be elsewhere. And above them all, high in candle-lit rooms with velvet curtains, lived the courtesans, women who had learned to turn conversation into art and seduction into survival. Unlike the working girls of London or Paris, Venice's courtesans were not merely tolerated, they were celebrated. The city even issued official licenses for them, under the same bureaucratic care it gave to traders and spice dealers. Some paid taxes, others paid bribes, but all were recorded in the books. And they had rules. They could not stand on bridges in daylight or call out to passing men. They had to wear yellow scarves, a lingering echo of shame from the Middle Ages. But at night, those scarves came off, and the masks went on. The mask in Venice was more than a disguise, it was an equalizer. A duke could meet a courtesan without risking recognition. A courtesan could entertain a cardinal without pretending to be impressed. And everyone could pretend that what happened on the lagoon stayed there. Now, there were two kinds of courtesans in Venice. The first were the courtigian di lume courtesans of the lamp. They worked the streets and canals, waiting for the glow of a gondola's lantern. Their lives were hard, brief, and largely unrecorded. The second were the courtigian honest, the honest ones who entertained scholars, diplomats, and artists. They owned libraries, played instruments, and quoted Dante between candle-lit verses of flattery. They were not only companions but muses, sometimes even political tools. These were the women whose words survived, written in ink and irony. Among them was Veronica Franco, one of Venice's most famous courtesans and one of its sharpest minds. Born in 1546 to a modest family, she was educated by her brother's tutors, unusual for a girl of her status. By her 20s, she'd become a celebrated courtesan, known for her wit and poetry as much as her beauty. Veronica didn't just entertain. She published. Her letters and poems were filled with elegant defiance, defending the intelligence and dignity of women in a city that reduced them to commerce. She even corresponded with nobles and scholars, reminding them gently that brains could be as seductive as beauty. In one of her most famous lines, she wrote, "If you seek virtue in a woman, know first that you must bring virtue yourself," which, for the 16th century, was practically a slap in velvet gloves. But even in Venice, fame had its price. When the plague returned in 1575, morality resurfaced with it, as it often does. The city grew paranoid, the government turned puritanical, and Veronica was accused of witchcraft. It was a familiar story. Men who once adored her now feared her power. She survived the trial, but her reputation never fully recovered. She died poor, though her name lived on a small miracle in a city that forgot most of its sinners. Still, the courtesans left their mark. They were educators of taste and speech. They shaped fashion, inspired paintings, and whispered secrets into the ears of ambassadors. They were, in a strange way, diplomats of desire. The Venetian Senate tolerated them because they knew their usefulness. A foreign dignitary was more easily persuaded after an evening of wine, music, and conversation with a woman who quoted Petrarch better than his own chancellor. The courtesans didn't just sell pleasure, they sold peace treaties, and Venice, ever pragmatic, saw no contradiction in that. Meanwhile, ordinary prostitutes, the Dilume women, lived in another world entirely. They slept in damp rooms above taverns, their beds separated by thin curtains and thin hopes. They were fined if caught working without a license, whipped if they moved outside their district. But they, too, were part of the machinery of the city. Every gondolier, every merchant, every sailor left his coin behind, and the Republic quietly collected its share. Venice didn't moralize about sin. It just wanted a cut. And there was the architecture, another silent witness to this world. Many of Venice's oldest buildings still have small shuttered windows near the canals, designed for secret exchanges and silent farewells. At night, you could walk past and hear laughter, music, the clinking of glasses, and the faint splash of water against wood. It's easy to imagine those evenings. A nobleman reclining in brocade, a courtesan in silk, quoting Horace, both pretending this moment would last longer than the candle between them. It rarely did. Venice thrived on illusions, political, financial, romantic. But illusions, when repeated often enough, start to look like tradition. Even the church in Venice learned to live with this double life. Priests warned about the snares of women, then paid for confession later. The city's rulers made laws against indecency, but always left loopholes wide enough for a gondola to sail through. It wasn't hypocrisy, really. It was balance, the art of keeping sin elegant. As centuries passed, the Venetian courtesans began to fade from glory. The city aged, its empire shrank, and its pleasures became nostalgia. By the 18th century, when visitors like Casanova came chasing adventure, they were walking through the echoes of a world already dying. Venice was still seductive, but now she wore too much makeup. The courtesans were replaced by performers, the brothels by coffee houses, and morality finally by boredom. Still, if you wander the quieter canals at night, you can almost hear them, a faint laugh, a line of forgotten poetry, a soft splash of an oar carrying secrets down the Grand Canal. Because Venice never really gave up its ghosts, it just learned to charge admission. Let's drift onward now, away from the perfumed lagoons and towards something less graceful but equally human, a place where even popes couldn't resist temptation. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, let's drift south now, away from the canals and candlelight of Venice, and into the warm, dusty air of southern France. It's the early 1300s, and we're arriving in Avignon, a city that once belonged to the popes, at least for a while. You might picture the papacy as an unshakable pillar of Rome eternal, immovable, bathed in incense and Latin. But there was a time when even the popes packed up and left town. They called it the Avignon papacy, or sometimes less politely, the Babylonian captivity of the Church. Between 1309 and 1376, 7 successive popes ruled from Avignon instead of Rome. And wherever popes went, power, money, and temptation followed close behind. Avignon, at first glance, was not built for holiness. It was small, provincial, and, to put it kindly, full of opportunity. But the arrival of the papal court changed everything. Overnight, the quiet river town became a glittering administrative capital. Cardinals arrived with their entourages, scribes, cooks, guards, and relatives. The streets filled with merchants selling relics, wine, velvet, and anything else a holy man might suddenly need. And soon, as always, came the brothels. Wherever there is wealth, there is enterprise. And the popes of Avignon, surrounded by bureaucracy and boredom, attracted plenty of both. It wasn't that the church endorsed brothels, at least, not officially. It was simply that the clerical population here was enormous. Some estimates say nearly 10,000 members of the papal household lived in or around Avignon at its peak. 10,000 celibate men. At least celibate in theory. Local authorities saw the writing on the wall. Rather than risk disorder, they designated a certain quarter of the city for worldly women. The result was a curious hybrid half-holy city, half-red light district. You could buy an indulgence in the morning and lose it again by nightfall. The women who worked there were called filles de joie, daughters of joy. A nice phrase, though joy wasn't always the right word. Some came willingly, many didn't. Some were widows, refugees, or servants turned out of households that couldn't feed them. Others were imported by traffickers who saw opportunity in the sins of holy men. Still, business was good. The brothels near the Rhone River thrived, with rents rising faster than cathedral spires. The papal courtiers complained in private but patronized them in public silence. One local chronicler, trying to be delicate, wrote, "The air of Avignon is sweet, the women sweeter, and the clergy most easily tempted." Avignon's moral contradictions became famous across Europe. Visitors were shocked or pretended to be. Petrarch, the poet and humanist, lived there for a time and described it as a sewer where all the filth of the world has gathered, and yet he never quite managed to leave. For all its corruption, Avignon was comfortable. The papal palace was vast, its banquets endless, and its wine excellent. Cardinals hosted feasts with musicians and dancers, the church's version of office parties, just with better embroidery. And the brothels flourished in the shadows, quietly paying their taxes. It's worth remembering that the church at this time wasn't a single, solemn face. It was a mosaic, some genuinely devout, others astonishingly pragmatic. For every monk copying scripture by candlelight, there was another running a side business in indulgences or hospitality. When moralists complained, church officials often replied with a shrug. Better to have vice organized and discreet, they said, than scattered in the streets. The same reasoning used by bishops in London or merchants in Venice. Human weakness, it seemed, needed management. And management, conveniently, required administration, which meant jobs, offices, and, inevitably, revenue. But then came the plague. In 1348, the Black Death rolled across Europe like a slow-moving shadow. Avignon was hit hard, tens of thousands dead, the air heavy with smoke and fear. For a brief, trembling moment, the city turned pious again. The Pope Clement VI did his best. He stayed in Avignon when others fled, burning fires day and night to purify the air. He bought burial grounds for the poor, and even absolved the dead en masse, just in case. For a time, the brothels closed. People believed the plague was punishment for sin, and no one wanted to risk divine attention. But as the years passed and life crept back, the old habits returned. Once the fear faded, so did the guilt. The daughters of joy reopened their doors, and the papal courtiers quietly visited again. Because, as ever, faith may be eternal, but willpower rarely is. What's fascinating about Avignon is how openly it all coexisted. The papal palace stood like a fortress above the city, while the brothels clustered below. One could attend vespers, confess, and stroll downhill into temptation in the space of an hour. Merchants sold rosaries and perfumes from the same stalls. Artists painted saints and sinners with the same brushes, and the same officials who collected alms from the faithful also collected fines from the brothel keepers. If hypocrisy were an art form, Avignon would have been Florence. Still, the popes eventually grew restless. They missed Rome, its prestige, its marble, its nostalgia. By 1376, the papal court finally returned to Italy, leaving Avignon to its ghosts. But the habits they'd left behind endured. The city remained a crossroads for pilgrims, traders, and pleasure seekers for centuries, and its reputation, half holy, half wicked, lingered long after the incense faded. Even today, if you walk through the old quarter at night, you can see where the narrow streets once led twisting, half-forgotten paths that once connected prayer and pleasure. The papal palace looms above it all, silent, solemn, and just a little too grand to be innocent. Looking back, it's tempting to judge them, the bishops, the priests, the merchants who profited from sin. But the truth is simpler and far less dramatic. They were human, hungry, lonely, occasionally sincere, often not. The medieval world was full of contradictions that somehow worked. Saints needed sinners to define themselves, and the church, no matter how holy, still needed coin to pay its masons and feed its scribes. And so, morality and money danced together, awkwardly, but persistently across the centuries. Let's drift a little farther now away from the popes and palaces and closer to the people who made all this possible, the women themselves. Because behind every rule, every tax, every sermon, there were lives lived in narrow rooms, between survival and disgrace. Hey, everyone. Let's drift now, away from the palaces and pontiffs, and into the narrow, quieter rooms where history rarely looks. We've heard what the bishops thought of brothels, and how the cities managed them like an unfortunate but necessary utility. But what about the people who lived inside those walls, the women whose names never made it into the ledgers? If you listen softly enough, you can almost hear them. The rustle of linen sheets, the scrape of a wooden chair on the floor, the muffled laughter drifting through thin walls. They were called many things: courtesans, bordelières, filles de joie, public women, Winchester geese. Each name polite enough to be spoken in public, but sharp enough to remind everyone of where they stood. They weren't supposed to be seen except by those who paid to see them. And yet somehow they were always visible, marked, regulated, and judged. The path into that life was rarely a single step. For most, it began with something simple: hunger, widowhood, or bad luck. Medieval Europe had few safety nets. If you were a woman without a husband, a dowry, or a family, you had three choices: service, begging, or selling what no law could take from you. Many women who ended up in brothels had once worked as servants. Some were dismissed for immodesty, a phrase that covered everything from theft to being found alone with a man. Others had been assaulted by their employers and thrown out afterward because, as the law saw it, scandal was worse than sin. And then there were the widows. Wars, plagues, and childbirth left thousands of women alone and poor. Few trades would accept them, and fewer still paid enough to live on. So they followed the same road many before them had, one that led toward the brothel door. The brothel, for all its cruelty, offered something the outside world didn't: structure. There was food, shelter, and a roof that kept out the rain. It was a grim kind of stability, but still more than some had known. Each woman paid rent to the madam, who in turn paid the city or the church. Some madams were former workers themselves, shrewd, protective, sometimes kind, sometimes ruthless. They managed the money, enforced curfews, and made sure the women wore their required colors. In London, that meant a yellow hood. In Paris, striped clothing. In Florence, a small bell around the neck so everyone would hear sin coming before it arrived. The point wasn't modesty, it was humiliation. The church may have tolerated vice, but it wanted to make sure everyone else despised it. Inside, life followed its own quiet rhythm. Days were spent cleaning, resting, or waiting. Nights were long, filled with men who smelled of ale, sweat, and absolution postponed. Some women made friends, forming fragile little families among themselves. Others kept to silence, speaking only when required. Every brothel was its own small world, part sanctuary, part prison, and sometimes, surprisingly, a place of strange tenderness. One 14th century diary from a Florentine official mentions a woman of the houses who wept when her companion was buried, though the priest refused her prayers. There's something profoundly human in that small act, grief in a world that denied her the right to it. Diseases were constant companions. Medieval medicine offered little comfort, a mixture of prayers, mercury, and bad advice. Health inspectors, usually older midwives, were supposed to check the women weekly. The tools were crude, the conditions worse, but it was better than nothing. If a woman was found to be ill, she might be quarantined, fined, or expelled. Expelled in this case meant simply sent into the street. There were no hospitals for her kind, and if she died, there were no prayers, either only a shallow grave at the edge of town, or beside a river that washed sins downstream. It's strange how much a society can depend on people it refuses to acknowledge. Not all stories were tragic, though. Some women found ways to bend the system just enough to survive, even to thrive. A few saved enough money to buy small shops or taverns. Others married customers who saw them as more than a passing comfort. In Avignon, court records mention a woman named Beatrice, once registered as a prostitute, later listed as a wine seller. When asked in court how she had earned her start, she replied, "From men who paid for my misfortune." It's one of those lines you wish history had written in gold. The church tried, occasionally, to redeem such women, though redemption came with conditions. In some cities, repentant women were placed in special convents known as Magdalene houses. They were expected to live in silence, sew for the poor, and pray for forgiveness. Some found peace there. Others escaped back to the streets. Because repentance, when enforced, felt suspiciously like another kind of captivity. Still, these convents existed for centuries, a quiet reminder of how closely sin and salvation were intertwined. We tend to imagine medieval women as passive, trapped in the roles men gave them. But within these narrow walls, some carved out a strange kind of agency. They learned to read men like ledgers, to gauge danger from a tone of voice or a hand on a coin purse. They knew which guards would protect them and which priests would look away. They were practical philosophers of survival, fluent in hypocrisy, skilled in diplomacy, and intimately acquainted with the limits of mercy. One could almost say they were the truest citizens of their age, living proof that morality, like everything else in the Middle Ages, depended on who you were and what you could afford. The city around them changed, of course. New kings, new laws, new epidemics. But the women's work stayed the same. Even when officials closed the brothels, the trade went on behind taverns, in rented rooms, on the edges of markets. When reformers demanded purity, the city simply learned to hide its shadow better. Human nature, as we've seen, doesn't vanish with legislation. It just moves to a new address. Every now and then, a chronicler would pause and describe one of these women with surprising warmth, noting her humor, her kindness, her beauty. It's rare, but those little glimpses remind us that they weren't just symbols of sin, but people with names, stories, and, sometimes, laughter. There's a record from Lübeck in northern Germany of a prostitute who left money in her will for bread and beer to be given to the poor at her funeral. She was denied burial in consecrated ground, but the townspeople came anyway because, as one wrote, she had a good heart, and few others did. History doesn't know her name or the sound of her voice, but maybe it doesn't need to. Sometimes remembering that she existed at all is enough. So when you think of medieval brothels, the taxes, the bishops, the courtesans, remember the countless unnamed women who kept the system running, who lived quietly between law and need, and who made history's great hypocrisies possible simply by surviving them. Let's drift onward, then, to the women who climbed higher. Those who turned sin into art and survival into power. The ones who entertained princes, wrote poetry, and left their mark in ink instead of dust. Hey everyone, if your eyes are still open, let's drift forward in time now out of the Middle Ages and into the soft light of the Renaissance. The world is changing. The plague has thinned the crowds. Printing presses hum softly in workshops, and people have begun to believe that beauty, not just faith, might lead them closer to the divine. In this new world, the brothel doesn't disappear. It simply evolves. Sin, as always, adapts faster than salvation. The courtesans of the Renaissance were not just survivors. They were performers. They understood that the game had changed that in a city full of poets and princes. Seduction required conversation, wit, and just the right amount of scandal. They became the new philosophers of pleasure, half muse, half merchant. To most people, they were still public women. But to those in power, they were something far more interesting, the only kind of woman allowed to speak freely in a room full of men. In Venice, Rome, and Florence, courtesans flourished. They entertained the wealthy and the learned men who discussed theology one hour and poetry the next, and preferred to do both with an attractive audience. The church frowned, of course, but not too harshly. After all, the popes themselves were quietly keeping mistresses and illegitimate children, which made moral outrage a little awkward. So the courtesans were tolerated, even admired, provided they knew their place and quoted scripture correctly when asked. The most famous of them, Veronica Franco, whom we met briefly before, belonged to this glittering class of cortesiane oneste, the honest courtesans. And the word honest here meant something fascinating. It didn't imply purity, but openness. She did not hide what she was, and in that there was a kind of truth the rest of society couldn't manage. Veronica wrote poems that made powerful men blush, and letters that made them think. She moved in salons where painters, philosophers, and politicians mingled, often blurring into one another after too much wine. Her art was conversation sharp, elegant, and sometimes devastating. In one letter, she reminded a nobleman who had insulted her that he owed her as much respect as any woman who has given him joy without deceit. There's something bold about that calm, almost bored honesty, like someone who knows she's already won the argument. Then there was Tullia d'Aragona, a Roman courtesan who could debate philosophy with priests and compose sonnets before breakfast. Her salon in Florence became a hub of Renaissance intellect. She wrote one of the first philosophical dialogues on love ever published by a woman. And of course, she was banned from attending church. Tullia argued that love was not sinful, that physical desire was part of divine design. It was a radical thought for her time, one that male philosophers happily quoted, though rarely credited. She lived, as so many courtesans did, between admiration and exclusion, invited to every party, but never truly accepted, celebrated in verse, but omitted from history books until long after her death. It's easy, from the soft comfort of hindsight, to see these women as glamorous, but the truth was more delicate. Their lives balanced constantly between luxury and ruin. Their fame depended on beauty, wit, and the patience of their patrons, things that could fade in an instant. A courtesan's home might be filled with books, silks, and painted portraits one year, and empty the next. One patron's death, one scandal, one rumor could end it all. But while it lasted, their freedom was almost unimaginable for women of the time. They owned property, they managed money, they read, traveled, and corresponded with scholars. They were, in many ways, The first professional women of the modern world paid for intellect as much as allure, and for that, society admired them, just not too loudly. What's remarkable is how many of them left behind words. Their poems, letters, and confessions survive in dusty archives, fragments of voices too clever to be erased completely. Veronica Franco once wrote, "I wish it were possible to show the world the wound I bear not of sin, but of judgment." That line might as well have been written by every woman who walked her path before or after. Because no matter how graceful, witty, or wise they were, society still called them sinners. They were admired privately and condemned publicly, a paradox the Renaissance excelled at. Some courtesans worked their way into noble families, becoming mistresses, then wives. Others faded into obscurity, replaced by younger, sharper versions of themselves. Their beauty was both their power and their ticking clock. But what they achieved in their quiet way was revolutionary. They forced powerful men to treat them as equals, if only for an evening. They turned conversation, a thing once denied to women, into a weapon, a currency, and an art. And, perhaps most subversively of all, they reminded an entire age obsessed with virtue that intelligence could be seductive too. By the 16th century, their legend had spread beyond Italy. In France, the courtesan savante, the learned courtesan, became a fashionable idea. Writers adored them, painters immortalized them, and moralists pretended not to notice how popular their portraits had become. Even the great moral reformers couldn't quite decide what to do with them. They scolded from pulpits, but still quoted their poetry. Because deep down, the Renaissance understood something the Middle Ages never quite did, that sin, when dressed in intelligence and grace, could pass for art. Yet for all their glitter, the courtesans knew the world would never forgive them completely. They lived in borrowed time, a delicate illusion held together by beauty, money, and men's forgetfulness. Veronica Franco died quietly in Venice, in a modest apartment, after years of illness and scandal. Her books went out of print. Her name faded until centuries later someone dusted off her verses and realized what she'd done. It's almost poetic that her voice, once dismissed as sinful, now echoes in lecture halls and libraries. She got the last word after all. It just took 500 years to arrive. So, the Courtesans' Golden Age came and went like candlelight, warm, brilliant, and inevitably brief. They ruled not by sword or law, but by the subtler empire of influence, the kind built from whispered secrets and stolen evenings. And when their era ended, the world returned to pretending it had never needed them. But their legacy remained in art, in poetry, and in the quiet rebellion of every woman who refused to be silent afterward. Let's drift now into the dimming light of the 15th and 16th centuries, when this glittering tolerance began to crack. The preachers grew louder, the laws harsher, and the moralists took the stage once again. Because naturally, when people start enjoying themselves, someone always decides it's time to stop. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, let's drift forward again past the candle-lit parlors and velvet gowns of the Renaissance into a colder, more anxious age. The lights are dimming now. The laughter that once echoed through Venice and Avignon has quieted. Europe is growing pious again, which is never good news for pleasure. By the early 1500s, the mood had changed. The same cities that once licensed brothels, taxed sin, and built churches beside taverns were suddenly discovering morality. Public virtue had become fashionable, especially among people who had never quite managed private virtue. And so began what you might call the Age of Repentance, when the Church, the monarchs, and the self-appointed reformers all decided that humanity had enjoyed itself quite enough. The turning point came with men like Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar of Florence, a man who believed that God's love was best expressed through public bonfires. He was tall, gaunt, and utterly convinced that Florence was sliding toward damnation, which, to be fair, it probably was. The city had grown rich on silk, trade, and sin. Its artists painted divine beauty with suspicious enthusiasm for the human body, and its brothels were as famous as its cathedrals. Savonarola arrived like a cold wind, preaching sermons so fiery that they made people shiver. He condemned everything gambling, vanity, courtesans, paintings, and even poetry. He told Florentines to burn their mirrors and lute strings, and they actually did. In 1497, his followers lit the bonfire of the vanities, tossing fine clothes, artworks, and even cosmetics into the flames. And among the ashes were the ledgers of several brothels official, city-licensed, and suddenly out of fashion. The moral tide had turned. In Venice, Rome, and Paris, similar movements followed. The Church, under growing pressure from reformers, tried to clean its image. Officials who once issued licenses for brothels began pretending they had never existed. The word bordel slipped out of public documents, replaced by phrases like House of Repentance or Charitable Refuge for Fallen Women. Everyone knew what those places had been, but pretending made everyone feel better. Even the popes joined the effort, reluctantly. After centuries of quiet indulgence, the papacy began to realize that running a holy empire and a red light district at the same time looked bad on parchment. In 1566, Pope Pius V, a man famously allergic to fun, launched a sweeping campaign of moral reform. He closed Rome's public brothels, expelled prostitutes from the city, and threatened anyone harboring them with excommunication. It sounded heroic until people realized that shutting brothels didn't erase desire, it just moved it to darker corners. The trade went underground, and with it, the safety that regulation once provided. Diseases spread faster, violence increased, and the same moralists who had demanded purity were suddenly very surprised by the consequences. But by then, purity was policy, and no one dared argue with virtue. Meanwhile, across Europe, the Protestant Reformation was gathering force. Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door, and suddenly every city was arguing about sin. Catholics and Protestants couldn't agree on doctrine, but both agreed that prostitution was a convenient evil to condemn. The old pragmatic idea that organized vice protected society was now seen as cowardice. The new mood demanded action, confession, and visible righteousness. So, in city after city, the brothels closed. Their former inhabitants were sent to convents, hospitals, or, more often, nowhere at all. Many ended up back on the streets poorer, sicker, and more invisible than before. It's a curious thing about moral reform. It always seems to hit hardest the people who can't afford morality. In London, the stews of Southwark, once the pride of the Bishop of Winchester's accounts, were shut down by royal order in 1546. Henry VIII, newly divorced from the Catholic Church and somewhat hypocritically married to morality, decreed that all houses of bawdry be suppressed. This was the same Henry who had 6 wives, a dozen mistresses, and an entire court whispering about his nightly adventures. But history has a dark sense of humor, and reform often begins with the least qualified reformers. The stews were demolished, The Winchester geese were driven out, and the city, which had relied on them for centuries, suddenly decided they had never existed. Venice, ever the pragmatist, tried to resist the Puritan tide a bit longer. It passed laws restricting prostitution, but quietly ignored them when the economy dipped. Tourists, after all, still paid better than theologians. But even Venice eventually succumbed to respectability. The courtesans who had once held salons and published poetry were replaced by anonymous street workers hidden from view. The art of conversation gave way to silence, and the city that had once sold its sins with style began selling nostalgia instead. By the 17th century, Europe had entered a new moral order. Sex was private, shameful, and preferably not discussed at all. Brothels still existed, but they were secret now, buried under euphemisms and hypocrisy. Respectable men still visited them, of course. But now, instead of joking about it in taverns, they confessed it in church and donated to charity afterward. The church had won the moral argument, if not the actual battle. Sin hadn't disappeared, it had simply learned to whisper. It's interesting how societies swing between tolerance and repression, like a pendulum that never finds rest. The same cities that once made sin bureaucratic now made it illegal. The same people who had taxed desire now punished it. But nothing truly changed. Desire doesn't vanish because a law's written. It just learns to hide behind the wallpaper. And the people who once walked openly under lanterns now walked in shadows. The brothel doors were closed, but the need behind them stayed wide open. You could say the fall of tolerance was inevitable. Every civilization eventually grows uncomfortable with its own reflection. The Renaissance had looked too long at the human body and found it beautiful, so the next generation decided it must be dangerous. They wrapped it up, covered it, and pretended holiness could be achieved through denial. But the story of sin is also the story of human adaptability. Even when locked away, it finds a way to breathe. And so, the moral pendulum began another slow swing toward repression, silence, and a very dull sort of virtue. Let's drift now to the quiet end of our story, the world after the candles were snuffed out, when the laughter faded and only memory remained. A reflection on what all this meant, not just for the women or the priests or the cities, but for the strange, stubborn nature of humanity itself. Hey everyone, let's drift one last time past the city gates, past the sermons, past the shuttered doors and quieted songs. It's the late 1600s now, and the medieval world has finally exhaled its last breath. The brothels that once paid taxes to bishops have disappeared, their foundations turned into warehouses or homes for the repentant. The courtesans' names have faded from memory, except when whispered by poets who miss their company. The rules have changed again, as they always do, but the people haven't. Desire, guilt, and hypocrisy, those are eternal. Only the paperwork changes. If you wandered through a European city in this new, respectable age, you'd see clean streets, stern faces, and not much laughter. The signs of sin were gone, or so people like to believe. But behind those respectable walls, the same old stories continued, only quieter. A servant girl sneaking out after curfew. A nobleman making private confessions in a locked chapel. A priest writing another letter to the woman he swore he'd never see again. The church had erased the brothels from its maps, but not from its conscience, and the cities had lost something too, that strange, uneasy honesty of admitting that people are human. You can almost feel the ghosts of it, lingering in the architecture. The curve of a stone stair where courtesans once sat waiting for carriages. The faded fresco on a wall that was repainted too many times to hide what it once meant. A window that looks out on nothing because the street it faced no longer exists. History has a way of pretending that the parts it doesn't like simply stopped happening. But the truth is quieter. Those stories don't end. They just fall asleep. Looking back now, it's hard not to feel a strange affection for that contradictory world. The Middle Ages, for all their cruelty, were oddly practical. They understood that sin was a constant something to manage, not destroy. And in that strange bureaucratic mercy, they showed a kind of realism the later ages forgot. When they licensed brothels, they weren't celebrating sin. They were admitting something simple. People are fallible. And for all their superstition and violence, that honesty feels almost refreshing. The brothels are gone now. But the human heart hasn't changed very much since the days when bishops kept ledgers of lust. We still draw lines between purity and indulgence, between what we want and what we're allowed to admit. And the same quiet bargain still lingers between desire and decency, comfort and confession. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that morality is rarely about good and evil. It's about what people can live with and what they can't bear to see. So, as the lights go out across the old cities of Europe, the laughter fades and the candles die down to ash, it's comforting in a melancholy way to know that the past never really leaves us. It just changes costume. The sins of the Middle Ages wear different clothes now, and they have better lighting, but they're still here, walking quietly beside us, whispering that we're not so different after all. And maybe that's what makes the story of the medieval brothels so strangely human. They weren't about lust. They were about how a society, however flawed, tried to live with its own reflection and almost succeeded. Hey everyone, if you've made it this far, you've traveled through 7 centuries of contradictions from Paris to Venice, from the bishop's ledgers to the courtesan's sonnets. You've seen how morality was measured, not in faith, but in paperwork. How sin was managed like plumbing, necessary, regrettable, and best kept out of sight. But beyond the irony and the absurdity, there's something deeply human in it all. Every rule, every sermon, every closed door was just another attempt to control what can't really be controlled, the restless, ordinary heart of people trying to find warmth in a cold world. Maybe that's why these stories linger, because they're not just about sin or sanctity, but about the long, stumbling effort to make sense of both. The popes, the bishops, the women in yellow scarves, they were all part of the same weary dance, circling between guilt and need, between heaven's promises and the body's demands. So tonight, as you drift off, remember that the past was never as distant as we like to think. Its echoes still move under our modern quiet, the same doubts, the same contradictions, just dressed in new words. Close your eyes. The candles are out now, the streets are silent, and the river carries away what's left of the night. Sleep well, and let the ghosts of the old cities fade gently into your dreams, because history, like desire, never really ends. It just lies down beside us, waiting to be remembered.